About the record producer and impresario Walter Legge. It's presented by Humphrey Burton. Part 3. A Passion for Quality.
Walter Legge, son of a tailor from Shepherd's Bush, was a self-taught impresario who was a producer of classical gramophone records, a music critic for the Manchester Guardian, and an opera administrator, all before he was 32. During the war, too short-sighted to fight, he organized concerts for troops and war workers, and quietly laid his plans for a brand new orchestra, which he launched only 2 months after the war ended. Legge invited his old friend Thomas Beecham to conduct that first concert. The fee was a good cigar, but Legge had no intention of letting the autocratic baronet assume control. He'd been Beecham's assistant at Covent Garden before the war, but now he was going to run his own ship. Beecham went off to found his own band, the Royal Philharmonic, while Legge used the Philharmonia as the house orchestra of the record company for which he worked, EMI, presenting the orchestra in relatively few public concerts each year, but paying the best players a good enough wage to have them on first call. His plans expanded in the late 1940s thanks to the interest in Western music of a young Indian prince, the Maharaja of Mysore. Until his money ran out, he subsidized Legge's ambitious concert plans and paid for recordings of neglected music such as the symphonies of Roussel and Balakireff, whose first symphony was dazzlingly delivered under the baton of Herbert von Karajan.
I think the most interesting remark that Legge made about the Philharmonia Orchestra was, I want to create an orchestra that has not a style, but style.
Karajan's biographer, Richard Osborne.
And I think it runs right through Legge's career as a record producer, as a writer, as an entrepreneur. He valued style. He recognized style, a bit like a terrier recognizing a rat. He knew it, he could sniff it out. He liked quality, and all these things went into the making of the Philharmonia. How Legge would have survived in our modern anti-elitist times, I have no idea. I would love to have heard some of his comments on these things, but he also, I think, would have echoed a remark Karajan once made to me. He said, people accuse me of being an elitist. He said, I'm not an elitist. He said, I'm a super elitist.
Two innovations in the recording industry in the early 1950s opened up new horizons for Walter Legge and his colleagues, tape recording and the long-playing record. At last, complete operas on disc could become a mass-market product. A Wagnerian since his teens, Legge was inevitably drawn to Bayreuth, where 1951 saw the reopening of the festival after the war. Herbert von Karajan conducted the Master Singers, in which Legge's partner and future wife Elisabeth Schwarzkopf sang the role of Eva. It was a moment for him to savor. two rival British companies were recording in Bayreuth that year, and Walter Legge felt that EMI was lagging behind. Richard Osborne.
He saw what marvellous equipment Decca had, and he immediately phoned back to London to ask for a specific type of microphone, so that EMI could record Meistersinger with that. And they said, you can't have it, it's too expensive, no money. So he bought them himself. And that's the kind of man he was. I mean, and I'm sure that annoyed the people back home. The damn man's gone off and bought these funny microphones he's heard that Decca have got. But that's how he tended to behave. I mean, if that was the best, then he had to have it.
The Mastersingers came out on an impossibly clumsy 34 discs, but those old 78 gramophones were soon history, as the LPs swept the board, and Carrion and Legge embarked on a huge recording program with the Philharmonia aimed at restocking the catalogue with basic repertoire. But Legge must have known in his bones that Carrion wouldn't stay with him forever. Furtwängler was old and going deaf, and Carrion, whose international career was burgeoning, was the obvious candidate to take over the Berlin Philharmonic. And so, as a sort of long-term investment, Legge signed up Otto Klemperer, a conductor who was already in his 60s and physically weakened from illness, but whose interpretations of Mozart and Beethoven were deeply powerful. Klemperer conducted the Philharmonia at the Festival of Britain in '51, and signed his EMI contract the next year. His first recording was of Mozart's Jupiter. Powerful, wrote Legge, incredibly transparent, and the structure marvellously revealed. Philharmonia orchestra was like a thoroughbred, an exceptionally responsive instrument. Toscanini chose it to play Brahms for his return to London. Karajan took it to Vienna for a famous recording of the B minor Mass. Legge's methods were dictatorial. His industrial relations were autocratic, to say the least. He had no truck with committees, but he was successful. The leader of the Philharmonia under Karajan, Klemperer and a host of others in the 1950s was Manuk Parikian.
There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Walter Legge was a very, very clever director of a symphony orchestra. He was also a very efficient recording manager. Sometimes he was very obstreperous. Sometimes he meddled with people, which was not to their liking. It was not to my liking either, when he started taking conductors off in the presence of the orchestra. That didn't make for happy relationships between conductor and orchestra. He was sometimes very short-tempered and very, very rude with players in the orchestra. There are numbers of instances of this. But then, I suppose, in order to create a first-class orchestra, you have to be a dictator sometimes, you have to be tyrannical, which Walter certainly was.
The Philharmonia was made up of virtuosos in every department. Their sight-reading skill was phenomenal. When in 1953 they recorded Hansel and Gretel under Karajan, the first read-through and balance test of the overture was perfect. It went into the final cut without a blemish. Could resist the orchestra's finely spun accompaniment in the opera itself. The evening hymn is sung exquisitely by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Elisabeth Grumer. To balance EMI's repertoire, Legge needed Italian opera, and he needed top singers to boost the sales. Tony Lecantro was at EMI himself for many years.
Like Geisberg before him, he kept his finger on the pulse, and a very good example of that, of course, is Maria Callas. Legge was aware of Callas right from the beginning, from the first time she appeared, and he knew that she was likely to be an outstanding artist, and he began negotiating with her in 1950. Negotiations were not easy with Callas and Meneghini, and it took Legge more than a year to bring them to the point of signing a contract with EMI. I think that's a good example where Legge immediately saw that Callas was an artist that EMI should get hold of, and he immediately set off to do so.
A thrilling production of Tosca was one of the first fruits of this important contract. Callas, in the title role, was joined by Tito Gobbi as Scarpia and Giuseppe Di Stefano as the painter Cavaradossi.
Nel pozzo del giardino vasto letta hai tradito maledetta e pensa quali nuove e vuol dire quell'aria fredda ho pensato e stupita come dove e non mi ha fatto vincitore e la sei in fuga.
Tosca, recorded at La Scala in 1953, the conductor Victor de Sabata. The rivalry between EMI and Decca continued unabated throughout the 1950s. EMI at La Scala with Callas, Decca's team under John Culshaw in Florence or Rome with Renata Tebaldi. Everything was still being recorded in mono sound, but there were marked differences in leadership style between the two companies. EMI's former head of A&R, Peter Allwood.
Culshaw was, shall we say, rather less of a potentate and prima donna. I would have thought that he was a team man, whereas I think Legge was very much firmly in control and had his acolytes around him. I mean, Suvi Grubb, one of the great EMI recording producers in later years, was Legge's assistant at the time and I know from people who witnessed it, was sent scurrying around the studio being called Monostatos by Walter, which today would be actionable, but I think Suvi took it in good heart.
In a life that could easily have been swamped by all those tense contract negotiations, hectic opera recordings and arduous concert seasons, Legge remained faithful to the intimate nuances of his first love, the art of song. Early in the 1950s, he signed up the young Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and put him into partnership with EMI's Gerald Moore.
Ich möchte ziehen in die Welt hinaus, hinaus in die weite Welt. Wenn's nur so grün nicht wär, da draußen in Wald und Feld. Ich möchte die grünen Blätter all pflücken von jedem Zweig. Ich möchte die grünen Gräser all weinen ganz totenbleich, weinen ganz totenbleich. Ach grün, du böse Farbe, du siehst mich immer an, so stolz, so keck, so schadenfroh, mich armen weißen Mann. Ich möchte liegen vor ihrer Tür in Sturm und Regen und Schnee und singen ganz leise bei Tag und Nacht das eine Wörtchen Ade. Das eine Wörtchen Ade. Ach, wenn im Wald ein Jagdkonzert, da kniet ihr Fensterlein und schaut sie auch nach mir nicht aus, darf ich doch schauen hinein. O Binde von der Stirn dir ab, das grüne Band, das grüne Band. Ade, ade, und reiche mir zum Abschied deine Hand. Ade, ade, und reiche mir zum Abschied deine Hand. Zum Abschied deine Hand.
Schubert's Die böse Farbe. Walter Legge tried to give the singer notes in his usual domineering way, but Fischer-Dieskau tells us in his memoirs that he made it clear such suggestions were not welcome, and for once in his life Legge fell silent. It did the recordings no harm. Operetta was another of his passions. Richard Osborne.
The interesting thing about Legge was that he realised that operetta is extremely difficult to perform. Getting the right singers, the right style, and the right conductors. And he was particularly good at choosing people to conduct operetta. Ackermann, Karajan, von Matichik. And he famously said that it's more difficult to find a good conductor of Johann Strauss or the best Lehar than it is to find somebody to squeeze out the face flannels of self-pity of Gustav Mahler. And there's some truth in that.
Wie die Weiber, man behandelt wird sie da. Eine so, die andere anders, da gibt's keinen Feldzugsplan. Dass die Weiber, bei uns bleiben also wie. Das hat man noch nicht erwöhnt, denn da gibt's kein Theorie. Der eine macht man Komplimente so und so und so und so und streichen ohne Ende so und so und so und so. Der andere muss man imponieren so und so und so und so. Man darf sie auch sogar schockieren so und so und so und so. Die dritte, die will Zärtlichkeiten so und so und so und so. Die vierte, die will Zankenstreiten so und so und so und so. Der fünfte will nur tanzen, lachen so und so und so und so. Andere Sachen, so und so und so und so. Ach, ja, das Studium der Weiber ist schwer, nicht uns Männer verteufelt auch her. Niemals kennt man an Seele und Leib, man das Weib. Mädchen zart, Mädchen arm, blondes Haar, mit dem treuesten blauäugigen Mann. Ob sie schwarz oder rot oder blond sind gefärbt, ist egal, man wird doch gegärt. Weiber, 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 ja, das Studium der Weiber besteht, gibt uns Männer verteufelt noch mehr. Niemals kennt Gott an Seele und Leib, man das Weib. Mädchen zart, Mädchen arm und das Haar, mit dem treuesten blauäugigen Mann. Ob sie schwarz oder rot oder blond sind gefärbt, ist egal, man wird doch gegärt. Ja, das Studium der Weiber ist schwer. Weiber, verteufelt auch Weiber, Seele und Weiber. Mädchen zart, Mädchen arm und das Haar, mit dem treuesten blauäugigen Mann. Ob sie schwarz oder rot oder blond sind gefärbt, ist egal, man wird doch gegärt.
A scene from The Merry Widow, one of the many operetta vehicles Legge mounted for Elisabeth Schwarzkopf. She and Legge were finally married in the year that recording was made. The pianist Graham Johnson believes that his love of Germany was a key to Walter Legge's personality.
Let's face it, Walter was a person who admired the German people and what German culture had produced. And he was very quick. I think he was one of the people who lost no time, to the credit of our music making in this country, of bringing immediately back into the fold without any dithering great German musicians, providing they survived their perilous denazification processes, which actually in some musicians' cases happened remarkably quickly, perhaps a little more quickly than they would today. I don't know. But I think that he couldn't help but admire great conductors, men of decision, people who had vision. And if you admire composers like Hugo Wolf, or Wagner, come to think of it, you admire merciless people who have a vision and they get it. And Walter was many extraordinary things, but he was not by nature a democrat.
Brüderlein und Schwesterlein, alle wir sein, stimmt mit mir ein. Brüderlein und Schwesterlein, du uns schenken für die Ewigkeit, immer so wie heut, wenn wir morgen noch daran denken. Erst ein Kuss, dann ein Du, du immerzu. Erst ein Kuss, dann ein Du, du immerzu,
Herbert von Karajan conducting Die Fledermaus. Karajan stayed with the MI for several years more and toured the USA with the Philharmonia. But Legge was under fire. Decca was making waves with its new stereo techniques. Legge's company lagged behind, unconvinced of the merit of stereo, which required the public to buy new equipment for the second time in a decade. Change was in the air. Furtwängler died, Toscanini died, and his likely successor, Guido Cantelli, was killed in a plane crash. Karajan went to the Berlin Philharmonic as expected. For the stereo age around the corner, Legge found new collaborators, Klemperer and Giulini being the most important. But for Richard Osborne, as for many of us, the first years of the long-playing record were the best years of Walter Legge's artistic life.
I think the great Legge recordings are the mono recordings he made of operas with Callas and particularly with Karajan. But where Legge had hand-picked casts, Karajan conducting, the Kingsway Hall or Abbey Road, they could make fabulous recordings, and he and his engineers had the art which the great radio producers had in those days. In mono, you could produce recordings with a marvellous sense of space, of distance and atmosphere.
And you can hear the final part at the same time next week of that series. It's at 3:30. These programmes about Walter Legge are presented by Humphrey Burton and produced by Clive Portbury. A programme charting the career of the record producer and impresario Walter Legge. It's presented by Humphrey Burton. Part 4, All or Nothing.
The year 1955 was a crucial one in Walter Legge's career. His Philharmonia orchestra was a decade old and among the best in the world. Wieland Wagner tried to hire it for Bayreuth, and it was to be resident in Salzburg at the festival the following year for the Mozart bicentenary. But it was going to need a new chief conductor, because Legge's trump card, Herbert von Karajan, had just taken over the Berlin Philharmonic. Legge's choice was the cantankerous 70-year-old Otto Klemperer, whom he characterized as the musician of the Ten Commandments carved in granite. Klemperer's Beethoven performances and recordings were hugely popular. Walter Legge was facing a technical challenge too, stereo. One of EMI's first stereo projects was Der Rosenkavalier, with Legge's wife Elisabeth Schwarzkopf as the marschallin and Karajan conducting. The stereo sound was balanced by an engineer in a separate room. Legge's overriding concern was less with high fidelity than with fidelity to Strauss's score, one of his favourites. And as usual, his flair for casting was immaculate, although the Octavian, Christa Ludwig, owed her place to a tip-off from his wife.
Elisabeth Schwarzkopf sang in Salzburg the Countess in Marriage of Figaro, and I was Cherubino, and she told her husband, there is a new voice, a young girl, and you could take her. And so he engaged me for the Octavian in Rosenkavalier with Karajan. And I must say he was very much hated by all our singers, because he was never content and happy with what we have done. You have almost to make love with a microphone, because you have to give the most beautiful sound of your voice, and you have to do a little bit more expression than normal in a recital, because the people, they listen, they don't see you. And so all this I didn't know, and he taught me this. If you sing something from rain, the people have to see the rain and to feel the rain from the sound of your voice. And if you sing something from the sun, the people have to feel the sun and to see the sun. I thought it was wonderful that I had such a teacher like Walter Legge.
Nobody in the record business knows more about the transition from mono to stereo than Karajan's biographer, Richard Osborne.
It was a very tricky period when stereo came in. Legge was very dubious about how to use it to best effect, and as we know, a lot of the early stereo recordings which other companies made were extremely crude. And so he sent his stereo engineer down the corridor into a little cubicle to do the stereo recordings, and he didn't bother about the editing of them, and they often didn't come out in stereo for 18 months, 2 years. Commercially, it was disastrous. But once he got the hang of it, by the time you get to the Böhm Così, the remake of The Merry Widow, he's really back to form. And then, of course, you get the Klemperer recordings by that stage.
In Klemperer's recording of Fidelio, Walter Legge cast Christa Ludwig in the role of Leonore.
I love this opera because of the humanity which is in it, and so I said always, only once in my life to sing Fidelio and then to die. And when I got this offer from Legge and Klemperer to sing Fidelio, I was so happy. You cannot imagine. This was a role I wished to sing.
In his Fidelio recording, Legge refused to add the spectacular sound effects that Decca was exploiting in its famous recording of The Ring. In the dungeon scene, you don't hear the clunking of the chains fettering Florestan to the prison wall, but you still know that John Vickers is in despair. The man who did Legge's job at EMI later on was Peter Allwood, recently retired. He's a great admirer.
He had an ear for musical transparency. And of course, in those days, before the age of multi-miking, which some people would say has actually glossed over detail to too much an extent,
Those recordings are, even today, amazingly clear in the fact that you can see the positioning of the orchestra, the strings, the woodwinds, the brass, and so on, and you feel it's a natural balance.
Otto Klemperer was renowned for his deliberate tempos, and not even Walter Legge could persuade him to change, as his EMI colleague Suvi Grubb remembered.
He was never unreasonable. He did accept always that there was another point of view of looking at it. But the only way to get him to accept this was the way that Klemperer used to, when he did the pastoral. The third movement, the peasants' dance, very slow, and Walter said to him, "Doctor, this is very slow." And Klemperer said, "Herr Legge, you think so? You will get used to it." And after the next take, he said, "Herr Legge, are you used to it yet?"
Klemperer's rustic pastoral. When illness forced him to withdraw from a planned recording of Don Giovanni, Legge handed the job to Carlo Maria Giulini, the Italian conductor he'd picked out as the best bet to succeed Toscanini. Richard Osborne.
Legge's greatest recording probably is that famous Don Giovanni, conducted by Giulini, who was a late stand-in for Klemperer. And it's a very interesting casting, that. I mean, earlier this year, that great baritone Cappuccilli died, and he was barely known. Young singer, just doing his first performances. Legge heard about him, spies everywhere. He was brought in as Mazzetto, his first recording. And you've also, on that recording, the young Joan Sutherland, Donna Anna, and what a fantastic Donna Anna. I mean, you see there in microcosm not only Legge's genius for picking out somebody like Giulini and his technical abilities as a recording producer, but what a cast.
I think Legge saw the recording studio as a playing field where he could actually manipulate and mould the artists to his will. Occasionally, it's possible that he might have imposed too much of his will. I think there's a very delicate balance in the relationship between a producer and an artist. The artist has ultimately to carry responsibility for the performance. Legge, I suppose, saw himself as primus inter pares, at least. But I think at the same time, he did know how to get the best out of artists. And the way he planned opera recordings, for instance, like a military exercise, They used to meet 4 or 5 weeks before recording as if it were to be a stage production, and literally the piano rehearsals would be minutely detailed. You couldn't afford to do that today.
Records like Don Giovanni sold well, but Legge's company, EMI, was a house divided and full of tensions. New recordings were casually commissioned without market research. There were senseless duplications of repertoire and stacks of unissued LPs piling up in the warehouse. Legge's autocratic management style was eventually challenged by somebody he couldn't ignore, the company's new boss.
Sir Joseph Lockwood, who was then chairman of EMI, invented what was called the International Classical Repertoire Committee, whose job it was to look at every single classical recording proposal and evaluate it from the point of view of the cost to make it and the expected sales over a period of 3 to 5 years. And that committee began operating at the end of the 1950s. And of course, Walter Legge greatly resented being told that he wasn't to make any new recordings until they'd been rubber-stamped by a committee. You could imagine that did not go down well with Mr. Legge.
Tony Lecantro, who saw him from inside EMI. Lord Harwood observed Legge at Covent Garden, where he was on the Opera House board for 5 years and at loggerheads with almost everybody.
Whether he thought that he was going to take the organisation over, I don't know. We certainly got the impression that he had given other people that impression. So I suppose we started defensively, I don't know. I actually, having mistrusted him at first, came, I won't say to trust him, but I will say to like him. He was enormously knowledgeable about opera, really enormously knowledgeable. And I suppose it is a pity that no setup ever existed whereby he ran an opera company. I think what he really wanted to do was to run a large organisation, and that he was frustrated from.
As you might expect, Elisabeth Schwarzkopf saw her husband in a different light.
He was a self-made man, and he didn't belong to the establishment, I know, and he had made himself into something very great.
Walter complained that most of his fellow board members at the opera couldn't tell the difference between Johann Strauss and Richard.
And he couldn't believe that people who were governing Covent Garden didn't know what they must know in that matter. No, they came there because they belonged to the establishment. And that was simply not enough for him.
25 years after he first produced it, Walter decided to round off his stereo recordings of Mozart operas with a magic flute conducted by Klemperer. A new discovery of his, Lucia Popp, sang the Queen of the Night. local fireworks were matched by fireworks backstage. Sir Joseph Lockwood, pushing the Beatles, cut classical production so steeply that Legge tried to hire out the Philharmonia to Deutsche Grammophon. He then decided to resign, to leave EMI, once he'd completed his projects, principally the Magic Flute. Over the winter, Legge became gloomier about the future of the Philharmonia, some of whose best players were being poached by the BBC. In March '64, he stunned the musical world by announcing the disbandment of the orchestra, to take effect later in the year after the recording of the flute. The players were deeply shocked, but some of the senior men, such as the principal flautist Gareth Morris, saw the strength of Legge's argument.
He had to disband it. As soon as the London Orchestral Concert Board appeared, the orchestras had to have grants. They couldn't play in the Festival Hall, which was owned by the Greater London Council, after all, which controlled the London Orchestral Concert Hall. From that moment, Walter, if he had still carried on with the orchestra, would have to have been one of 4 London orchestras. And Walter didn't want to be one of anything. He wanted to be just him. And his orchestra must stand alone in grandeur.
The Zauberflöte sessions begin, and after a couple of days, Klemperer then says that he wishes to call some piano rehearsals in his hotel suite for the principal singers. And, of course, Legge expects to attend these piano rehearsals, and what happens is that Klemperer says, "No, Mr. Legge, you can't come to my piano rehearsals. These are my private piano rehearsals. This has nothing to do with your recording. I want to rehearse my singers in my hotel suite, and you are not welcome. Do not come." That was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Legge immediately walked out. Klemperer is furious with Legge. Elisabeth Schwarzkopf is one of the singers in the recording, and she's contracted to do it, so she can't walk out, obviously. And it must have been a pretty horrendous thing that Legge left behind as his last gift to EMI. A difficult man parting with a very difficult gift.
After a bitter exchange of telegrams, Legge threw in the towel and quit EMI forever. For him, it had to be all or nothing. Klemperer was angry because Legge had broken up the Philharmonia without consulting anybody. Legge said he did give a warning, but his mind was made up anyway. Orchestras are living things, however, and with Klemperer at their head, the new Philharmonia, as it renamed itself, refused to accept Legge's diktat. Walter Legge was only 58 when the crisis came. Over 3 decades, he'd produced a staggering 3,500 records. He lived another 15 years in self-imposed exile, first in Switzerland and then France, tending the flowers in his garden, writing memoirs, and travelling the world to supervise his wife's recitals and recordings. Later they gave master classes together. Despite his enormous experience, none of the other big companies offered him production work, not even a consultancy. He'd resigned from Covent Garden and wasn't asked back. He was greatly excited when Wexford appointed him artistic director of its annual opera festival, but a heart attack knocked that scheme on the head before he could start work. Walter would come to London occasionally to gossip over dinner with his friends, myself included, and his stock of jokes, many of them in questionable taste, seemed inexhaustible, but the stuffing had been knocked out of this proud man. Peter Allwood used to see him at Salzburg, where Karajan had his home.
I'm afraid he rather dropped Walter. I can remember a rather sad incident in Salzburg, shortly before Walter died, when Walter was in residence, hoping Karajan would call. He never did. He used to tell all people, "I'm sorry, I can't meet you today because I'm sure Herbert's going to call." And of course Herbert never did, which is terribly, terribly sad.
Richard Osborne knows why Walter Legge was disliked in so many quarters.
It was the nature of the personality. I think there was a lot of jealousy. I mean, he was so talented. He was so self-confident. And the legacy, of course, is embarrassing to a company like EMI, because in the late 90s they revived that marvellous series, Great Recordings of the Century. And you look at what's in that series, and you see that Legge has made the company hundreds of thousands of pounds over the years, from recordings which at the time he had to fight to get made. It's basically quality will out. Quality lasts, and it was quality that Legge devoted his life to.
passion for quality, that refusal to compromise, is what made Walter Legge such an important figure in musical life. He was a genius for many, a bit of a monster for others, an outsider who died in 1979 without receiving any kind of honour from the state. Let Elisabeth Schwarzkopf have the final word.
I think this country did behave in an abominable way to Walter, in an abominable way. This is why I have him buried in Vienna. The first moment I had a bit of quiet, about an hour and a half after he died, I went to the telephone and telephoned the Hugo Society in Vienna and said, now, will you please do everything and help me so that his ashes can rest very near Hugo Wolf on the Wiener Zentralfriedhof, because in his own country they did not in his lifetime recognize the genius he was. But in Vienna they did. I think he has done more in his life, in every way, than many people ever will a tenth of that achieve. He has heard music, lived music, made artists, made records, made the most wonderful orchestra in his time, given England, and not only England, the most marvelous time of music making. I think people will agree that he did set the standards here.
That was the last of 4 programmes about Walter Legge. They were presented by Humphrey Burton and produced by Clive Portbury.